In this video, I take the idea of ruining a truck to a whole new level. It's ruined. Welcome back to the Scale Builders Guild. Thanks again for watching. Today we're taking a look at the SSD Trail King and the Rex Racer 19 Chevrolet K10 conversion kit. And in the previous video, we actually did all the major cuts to the RC four-wheel drive Blazer body to make it into a proper pickup. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to ruin one. But in the best way possible. This is all about weathering and finishing this truck. And a lot has happened since the last episode. So why don't we go over some of the things that I've already accomplished. From the beginning, my intent was always to make a rusted, weathered, beat up old pickup truck, and I always thought that these square bodies were a really great example of that. There are still a ton on the road today, and brings me to my first point, how easy it is to find great reference material for when you're doing a build like this. Weathering is a pretty difficult thing to master, and I am by no means a master. I definitely have a lot to learn still. There are some really excellent resources out there, but the best resource is the full-size world. There are photos all over the internet of what these trucks look like after years of neglect and abuse, and it is a great way to discover the commonalities of weathering and what these trucks actually look like in the real world. I can't stress that enough. Rust and weathering and the details that go along with those things are really hard to replicate unless you have a great example. So by all means, fire up your Google machine and find some great images to start with. It is an excellent free resource and will give you tons of ideas on how to do this kind of weathering properly. Since the last time we took a look at this truck, it was still not even primered. It was just basically assembled. Once everything's been glued, I actually hit all of the 3D printed parts with a thin layer of CA glue. I use a little scrap piece of styrene to kind of use as almost like a spatula to get it into all of the spaces. Because the SLS nylon is a fairly porous, rough print at the very end, it is a good idea to try to smooth that out, and the quickest, easiest way is to use CA. You can use any kind of body filler as well. I just find that CA works really, really well. Once it's cured, give it a nice hard sanding. I start with like 120 grit and go all the way down to 1500 grit to make sure I'm getting a nice, smooth, uniform finish. I have a couple of sponges that I use from Tamiya that have those grits, and they work really, really well. One other thing to mention on this bed, in order to get it to sit properly on the chassis, I did have to 3D print some mounts. In order to hide the bed mounts, I did put in some inner fenders. This is just some vacuum formed styrene that I had from my friend Part of My Noob. Probably not intended for this purpose, but I think they look pretty good in there as well. Once I did all the prep on the bed to make sure that these two parts were going to be seamless, I went ahead and started doing some denting and some pre-rusting preparation. And the denting is super easy. Use a heat gun, heat up the body panels really, really hot, and then find a good rock and just kind of smush that rock into those panels to make really accurate looking dents. There's one here on the bed that I'm very proud of. I think it actually looks exactly like somebody's dropped something pretty heavy on there, or someone's backed into it with maybe a forklift or something. There's another good dent on the driver's side door that actually looks to me like he may have opened the door on like a parking post or something. Just really, those tiny little details add so much to a truck, and you need to do them before you do any paint work. Additionally, these rust holes along the rear fenders of the bed here, I used my Dremel and a very small drill bit to create all of these holes and all of this distressed sort of look. And why I did that first, before I did any priming or painting, was I wanted to make sure that I actually made it look like the rust was behind the paint. And I guess you could call this a reverse chipping technique, as you'll be doing all the painting afterwards. Because this body started as a Blazer, this tailgate was not at all accurate, and my friend Richard, also known as Pardon My Noob, was more than happy to point out all the foibles I made along the way and made sure that I did this bed tailgate properly. So there is a tall groove that goes along the top of the tailgate from a Blazer. That has to be removed. Also, the way the tailgate opens, the latch is different, so that had to be removed as well. And now it's all proper. There's another big dent in this panel as well, and I just think it looks so accurate. I'm really, really pleased with how it turned out. Once all of your denting and major rust abuse has been done to the bed, or to the whole truck for that matter, then you can go ahead and prime everything. What I did was, to make sure that reverse chipping technique worked, was I taped over all of the rustiest areas so I could actually go back in later and fill that in with rust paint and still have the layer of actual paint resting above it. Once I had primed the vehicle, it was time to decide on some paint colors, and because this is an old truck and I wanted to model it as such, I see a lot of examples where the cab and the bed don't match. So I wanted to try to do that here. I haven't seen any specific examples of this exact mismatch, but it is something that I wanted to give a shot, and it's colors that I had on hand. I did a couple different shades of red that I had, some Krylon paint, some Tamiya paint, whatever worked. Just kind of sprayed it on aggressively and randomly to give it a very weathered and kind of muddled look. A lot of the rusting and weathering that has happened here, I used a lot of Vallejo environmental acrylics, and these are an assorted bag of all different types of pigments and textured paints that do all kinds of different things. They have one specifically for rust. They have one for dust and grime. They have one for engine soot, and that will come into play later when I show you the engine. There are even wet effects, and that helps make this rust really look like rust, because rust does have that sort of shiny sheen to it once it's been really well aged. But these are all really excellent techniques, and Vallejo is kind enough to provide a ton of tutorials on their YouTube page, which I will link to down below. It came in very handy for using some of these acrylics that I wasn't too familiar with, and I'm really, really happy with how they worked. The rust specifically looks really, really accurate. It is a textured paint, so apply it very conservatively. I found that combining it with a little bit of a rusty wash definitely really makes it look even more like rust, and a little bit of that wet effects over top to make it really kind of pop. And because of the way the paint was laid down and I taped off that rust area first, you can actually see the differentiation between the layers of the paint and the rust underneath it. It really, really worked well. I also applied some very thin scratches along the sides of the body and into the paint and into the primer, just so they really actually look like they've been affected by age and rust and weathering. Once all of the basic weathering was achieved, I did an entire wash over the entire truck of a brown mixed with a little bit of rust wash as well. For rusting in corners and edges, I find it, rather than using a paintbrush, it's a really great idea to find a little piece of sponge. This is just a makeup brush sponge that I use. I've torn it up in little bits and pieces so it has a nice randomized pattern. I dip that in the paint. I also remove a lot of that paint on a paper towel before I start using it, and then I apply it very delicately into the corners to give a natural kind of spotted rust effect, like it's starting to pop through the paint. And I find this to be a really effective way of adding some detail without using a lot of paint. On the rear tailgate, I wanted it to look as if the owner of this truck had tried to do some work on it, but then gave up on it. I see this a lot in trucks and cars everywhere. So I applied a little bit of Bondo to some of the areas, sanded some of it down, and then just left it. I didn't do anything else to it. I just think it really kind of adds a whole other dimension of actual use to this truck. The goal on this build was to try to not purchase anything new, try to use whatever I had in my workshop and these bins all over the place. I was going to try to not buy anything new and try to keep as much stuff scratch built or close to it as I could. Which explains this new wheel and tire combo. These are RC four-wheel drive mudslingers in the 1.55 size, paired up with gearhead beadlock wheels. I've had these forever on a couple of different trucks, and they just sort of was sitting in my bin, and I said, you know what? That's going to be a perfect tire and wheel combo for this K10. They look used and cruddy, and why not even make them more used and more cruddy by artificially wearing down the treads? No self-respecting K10 owner of this vintage would have new tires on here for sure. So what I did was I chucked them up in my drill and ran them at high speed against some very, very coarse sandpaper to wear down the treads to almost an unsafe level. It, to me, just adds another little level of realism to the truck. Certainly hurts performance, which is not something I'm after with this vehicle anyway, but just adds a nice little bit of detail, and I'm really happy that I did that. I will make sure that all of them are pretty worn down, but one I'll do extra worn down just to give it that unrotated look. The rear bumper was also rusted using the environmental acrylics from Vallejo. Just really kind of, again, makes it really look accurate. Before I rusted it though, I did remove a ton of the chrome with some oven cleaner, and be sure to do that outside because that stuff is noxious and will definitely hurt you. But it just kind of also made it muddled and made it look like maybe some of the chrome had stuck behind. And I think it looks really awesome. One of the major differences between a Blazer and a K10 is where the fuel goes in. So to remedy that, but also make it look kind of interesting, I filled in where the original fuel door was for the Blazer, and then taped it off and primed it so it looked like I had fixed some sort of other error in the paint, and then gave up on the rest of it. The overspray is intentional to make it really feel like this guy just doesn't really give a care and isn't very good at repairing things. And then I did put the fuel door in the proper location and just 3D printed a little fuel door, which is like a twist-off cap, which is accurate to a 78 K10. You'll also start to notice that I've also done all of the trim work, or this trim on a real truck is chrome and plastic and glued onto the truck. For whatever reason, RC 4-wheel drive doesn't include this on their Blazers. Maybe it wasn't an option on the Blazer and it was only on the pickups. But I wanted to recreate it as best I could and also make it look really crappy. So in a lot of cases, the actual trim isn't there. And if you look very closely, you can see some of the glue left behind, or the residue from the glue, where the trim would have been. I'm kind of pleased as punch with how that turned out. I think it's a nice little added detail and really kind of sets this truck apart. There is a lot going on in this truck and so much more to come. I've only really just scratched the surface. Down to the primer, I guess. So I do hope that you will stay tuned. There will be a ton more on this truck, including wiring up all the electronics and getting it out for a run. Hopefully, we'll actually be able to go outside again soon. No self-respecting K10 owner would have both tail lights installed, so I had some red duct tape here, and I thought I'd just tape it up in an interesting way to make it appear as if that lens had been cracked or broken off or lost or never installed again. I also took the time to weather that Chevy motor that's in there. Again, just using my airbrush and a bunch of different weathering techniques to make it kind of look rusty and old and cruddy, like it probably runs, but not very well. So there you go. That's where we're at with the SSD Trail King K10 conversion. I'm really pleased with the progress. I've had a ton of time as of late to actually take the time to do this right, and I'm really happy with the results so far. This kind of weathering is very easy to do, especially with some of the tutorials that you'll find on Vallejo's YouTube page, and just following some simple instructions. The best advice I can give you about weathering, when you start to think that maybe you've done too much, stop, because that's the exact right amount. A few more things to do still. I'm very happy with the progress that I've made so far, and I hope that you're enjoying watching this video. If you have any questions at all, by all means, post them down below. I love reading through your feedback, and I try to answer as many of them as I can. If you've got any specific questions about weathering, I'm more than happy to answer. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that notification bell so you get updates anytime there's a new video from the Scale Builders Guild. Don't forget, of course, we have our Teespring store going still. If you like this hat, you can buy one just like it. So I invite you to go check that out or explore our merch bar right underneath this video. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you again soon.